This is largely because many countries in the global south, including China, India, and states in Central Asia, ignore these sanctions by and large and continue to buy Russian oil and continue to trade with Russia. The average age of the Ukrainian soldier who is fighting Russia is 43 to 45 years old. That Zelensky refused that peace deal because the UK told it to under Boris Johnson. Is Russia winning the war in Ukraine? It seems that right now the answer to that question can only really be yes. And it's a yes because of what the Russian leadership wants to get out of this war. So while the West would have you believe that Putin is on this kind of Hitlerian march where he won't end just at getting Ukraine, he wants to move on to claim Poland, Moldova, and Romania, it doesn't seem from the Russian leadership really that that is the case. What Russia wants is a demilitarized buffer zone in terms of the territory that it already occupies in Ukraine. It wants to take that territory, it wants to demilitarize it, create it as a buffer zone between it and pro-NATO states, and in doing so, it wants the defeat of the Ukrainian military. So in terms of achieving that defeat, it is really besting Ukraine in two terms, mainly manpower and weaponry. So in terms of manpower, Ukraine is really struggling right now with not having enough troops on the front line, as well as the age of the troops that it does have on the front line. The average age of the Ukrainian soldier who is fighting Russia is 43 to 45 years old. And also in terms of the numbers of manpower that they have, in terms of the number of troops, 650,000 men of fighting age in Ukraine have fled the country since the war began. Russia, purely by virtue of its population size, it doesn't have that issue as acutely as Ukraine does, and so it enjoys a significant advantage of Ukraine in this sense. The second issue is that of artillery. Russia is producing 3 times more artillery munitions than the US and Europe combined, and that's why we see Zelensky constantly appealing to the US and to the European leadership, saying, fine, thank you for giving me funds, but what I really need is ammunition. What I really need is weaponry. And that is something that they can't do for him because they don't manufacture that. Russia, meanwhile, has entirely pivoted towards the war economy. It is producing 3 million artillery munitions a year. It has been running its artillery factories 24/7 on rotating 12-hour shifts. And in addition to that 3 million, it is also getting more munition, artillery munition, as well as other drones and missiles from Iran and North Korea. That also explains Putin's recent trip to Pyongyang. It was an acknowledgement of this defense relationship and the request for, more arms and more defense exchanges in the future between the two countries. Meanwhile, all that Europe and the US have managed to give to Ukraine over the past 2 years is 1.2 million artillery munitions per year, which is really nowhere near enough for Zelensky, for Ukraine, to be able to fight this war in a way that it can win. Russia's economy has also done very well, very unexpectedly well, out of the war, despite the level of sanctions which were imposed on it by the West. This is largely because many countries in the global south, including China, India, and states in Central Asia, ignore these sanctions by and large and continue to buy Russian oil and continue to trade with Russia. Russia's GDP now outperforms that of Germany's, and Harper's Magazine, it did a piece where it went and it interacted with people from Russia. It called it Behind the Iron Curtain. And Russian oligarchs were quoted as expressing their support for Western sanctions, going as far as to say the West should have imposed them back in the 90s. We'd be the engines of the world by now, too bad. The question is now what a peace deal would look like between these two warring states. We now know that a peace deal was floated by Russia to Ukraine when they were having talks in Turkey in March 2022, that being 1 month after Russia invaded Ukraine, where Putin offered a series of concessions, essentially, where he said Ukraine could join a multilateral security agreement with the UK, France, as well as other countries. These would essentially function like NATO, all but in name. He also said that Russia would withdraw. He also said that we would discuss the status of Crimea over a period of 15 years. Crimea has been occupied by Russia since 2014. We also now know that Zelensky refused that peace deal because the UK told it to under Boris Johnson. And it is likely that he did agree to that because Ukraine was doing better at the war at that time. It had just had a very successful counteroffensive. And now the deal on the table is for Ukraine to have lost a huge swaths of their territory. And that is the deal that Putin is offering, that they should ceasefire, and that would now be Russian territory, which would operate as a buffer zone. And it's quite shocking that as far back as November 2022, we had US generals such as Mark Milley noting that the war is not winnable anymore for Ukraine militarily. And it does seem that while the West wanted that Ukraine would be Russia's Afghanistan, that it would bleed it dry over a time, it is now losing a lot of that ground. And the people I feel for the most here are the war-weary Ukrainians, who have been betrayed by the West, which decided that they were willing to sacrifice its state and its civilians at the altar of their own politics. And I think it's now time for Zelensky and the people of Ukraine to decide whether it was worth it.